Hello my friends, welcome back to Garhdo Goes Geek. Today I just wanted to talk a little bit about one of my favourite fandoms and also one of my biggest annoyances, which is the setting and fandom for Warhammer. Now this is something I've already discussed in blog form. I have a blog now, garhdogoesgeek.blogspot.com, but I thought this is worth reiterating, so I'm putting it up here as well. Hope you'll enjoy it. So, for those who aren't aware, Warhammer is the name of a series of settings used for games created and published by Games Workshop, a British model-making company based in Nottingham. Their first game was Warhammer Fantasy Battle, which was published in 1983. It was inspired by their previous work with Dungeons & Dragons, which Games Workshop got started by publishing content for, including creating the Githyanki, who recently appeared in Baldur's Gate 3. But Warhammer was an evolution. It was designed to use the miniatures that Games Workshop had been making in combination with more traditional tabletop RPG mechanics to create a sort of tabletop battle game. The Warhammer world, as the setting became known, was a fantasy world of heroes and magic, featuring wizards, knights, elves, dwarves, dragons, undead and orcs, in a world full of all the usual fantasy tropes inspired by the works of writers such as J.R.R. Tolkien, Robert E. Howard and Powell Anderson, as well as a lot of the real-world history that the creators Brian Ansell, Rick Priestley and Richard Halliwell had studied and been fascinated by. The second edition of the rules was then released in 1985 with a more traditional Warhammer Fantasy roleplay game designed to work alongside it, released in 1986, both of which helped the setting to develop into something that had its own identity while still wearing its inspirations pretty heavily on its sleeve. There were novels published by Games Workshop's in-house publishing arm, the Black Library, which helped to build the lore and characters of this universe, while the editions continued to refine the rules and gameplay. Warhammer World had its own lore for each faction, centuries of history for the setting, and distinct rules for magic, which was divided into the 8 winds of magic. There were also many factions for the game, such as the various human nations that had several societies and political relationships between them, such as the Empire, founded by the mythical hero Sigmar, the Arthurian-inspired Kingdom of Bretonnia, and the undead Tomb Kings of Kenry, led by the necromancer Nagash, as well as the deep dwarf holds of Carrick Eightpeaks, the High Elves of Ulthuan and their Dark Elf cousins in Nagaroth, the lizard men of the jungles of Lustria, the vampire counts of Sylvania, the ogre kingdoms, the under empire of the Skaven ratmen, as well as the legion of orcs and goblins that roam the world fighting everyone. Warhammer Fantasy would continue on for a further 6 editions, before the setting finally came to a conclusion with the release of The End Times in 2015. But it has been recently re-released as Warhammer The Old World, which is bringing back the classic setting, albeit earlier in its timeline, to focus on several of the lost and forgotten factions. The End Times also led to the launch of the new wargame, Warhammer Age of Sigmar, which was itself a sort of semi-sequel / reboot of Warhammer Fantasy, in a new and more mystical setting of the Mortal Realms. The Mortal Realms are 8 lands, each formed by one of the winds of magic and linked via magical realm gates, where mighty heroes and gods can battle monsters and ravenous hordes, with several factions and characters transitioning into the new setting and gaining new forms in it. Both of the settings are a lot of fun and full of some pretty incredible characters and models, as well as many great novels and video games and other tie-ins. But I was never personally as drawn to Warhammer Fantasy or Age of Sigmar as I was to one of Games Workshop's other settings. Because Warhammer Fantasy's success led to the release of Rogue Trader, the first book of what would become Warhammer 40,000, which was published in 1987. And the latter editions of that game, especially its third edition, which was when I discovered it, would capture my imagination with just a relentless grip. Rogue Trader is very quaint in its original incarnation, with the fictional setting of the 41st millennium essentially being Warhammer Fantasy in space. So elves were now Eldar, orcs were now space orcs with a K, the dwarves were the Squats. But the main faction was the Imperium of Man, which is a fictional, dystopian, hyper-fascist autocracy inspired more by Frank Herbert's Dune, the comics of 2000 AD, and a satire of British Thatcherism, rather than the fantasy and history influences of the predecessor. The Imperium was ruled by the God Emperor of Mankind, a figure who, while worshipped as a living deity, is actually an almost dead psychic warlord, kept clinging to life through a combination of the golden throne he is interred on, itself powered by dark magic, and daily human sacrifices. The armies of the Imperium, from the human Imperial Guard to the superhuman Space Marines, are not the valiant heroes of the Empire and Bretonnia, but brutal soldiers that exist purely to enforce the will of the High Lords that rule in the Emperor's stead, enforcing his will against aliens, heretics, and mutants across the galaxy. It's a great setting, and it's one that I think was improved even further by the introduction of the Realms of Chaos books in the late 80s and early 90s, which added the concept of chaos to both Warhammer 40,000 and fantasy. I think I've said it before, but chaos is probably my favourite concept in Warhammer, and it's one of the things that I think most distinguishes it from other fantasy and science fiction settings. The biggest inspirations for chaos are the works of Michael Moorcock and H.P. Lovecraft, as well as elements of stories such as Paradise Lost and Forbidden Planet. Chaos exists because of the warp. The warp is an alternate dimension called the Immaterium that exists outside of our physical world, where concepts like time and distance are completely meaningless. It is where psychic abilities and magic originate, reflecting the souls of every living being in the universe in a realm where thought can be given form and demons can sprout into sentience from nightmares and bloodshed. It is a realm ruled by the gods of chaos, immeasurably powerful beings who play a great game with the souls of mortal beings as the prizes. The four gods are the vicious Khorne, lord of rage and murder, the jolly Nurgle, lord of disease and decay, the scheming Tzeentch, lord of change and sorcery, and the alluring Slaanesh, lord of pleasure and excess. They all of them have their own minions and mortal followers, as well as rivalries and allegiances between them. The existence of the warp and chaos makes the metaphysical real and tangible, as gods and souls now exist as quantifiable facets of the universe, putting characters and armies at greater risk than that posed by normal warfare. In fantasy, chaos entered the Warhammer world by coming through the ancient portal gates at the poles, creating the winds of magic and inspiring mortal followers in what would become the Chaos Wastes, and threatening all of the mortal races from then on. In fact, it was the forces of chaos that would eventually destroy the Warhammer world in the end times, leading to the creation of the mortal realms themselves. In 40k, however, chaos had a much more significant and much more insidious influence, being woven into the backstory of the setting in a way that enhanced many of the factions at play and helped to create and solidify the grimdark aesthetics that Warhammer would become not just known for, but emblematic of. Now, I've covered a lot of Warhammer 40,000's lore in a previous podcast episode. where I also discuss some of my issues with Games Workshop and its practices as a company that were becoming quite well known at the time. So while I won't reiterate every single point, I do want to cover again some of the main elements for context. First, it is important to bear in mind that 40k, while having plenty of purely fantastical elements, is a science fiction setting first and foremost, and it ostensibly takes place in our far future, specifically the 41st millennium, with the current calendar putting us in the 3rd millennium, so that gives you an idea of just how far in the future that is. However, the history of the setting doesn't really begin until the 15th millennium, which itself is over 12,000 years in our future. For context, the pyramids of Giza, which were constructed in ancient Egypt, are less than 5,000 years old. So that gives you an idea of just how substantial a time jump this is. From the 15th to the 25th millennia, mankind spread throughout the stars in a period known as the Age of Technology, using a subspecies of mankind known as the Navigators to help guide their ships through the roiling miasma of the warp, allowing for faster than light travel, albeit in a very dangerous way, akin to old sailors taking their ships across an ocean storm. The galaxy was a harsh place. It's infested by dangerous Xenos races, with the Eldari and their empire being one of the largest organised forces arranged against the nascent human colonies. As well as the Orcs, fractured clans of fungoid brutes that form large gatherings known as Wars that rampage through space seeking strong enemies to fight. However, mankind was far from defenceless, building incredible weapons and warships through forge worlds like Mars to arm its forces as they spread through the galaxy, including the robotic Men of Iron, soldiers with artificial intelligence powering them. However, the Men of Iron rebelled against mankind, and after a cataclysmic conflict known as the Cybernetic Revolt, much of this golden age was lost, and a lot of advanced technology was then looked upon with superstition and distrust. Abominable intelligence was outlawed, with all advanced machines requiring a human component to remain trustworthy, with the secrets of technology only known by the priesthood of Mars. This period became remembered as the Dark Age of Technology. In the wake of the destruction began the Age of Strife, where human psychers began to appear with increasing regularity, their untrained minds allowing chaos to gain a foothold in real space, leading to the collapse of the human civilization as warp storms divided real space, dividing the worlds of mankind in a time that would become known as Old Night. While mankind struggled, however, the Eldari were at their apex. They did not travel through the warp in the same way as mankind, instead using the artificially constructed webway to traverse the warp, completely protected from the demons that roam the Immaterium. And on the Eldari homeworlds, the powerful race began to fall to depravity. As the boredom and ennui of their immortal lives began to set in, pleasure cults began to be forged, seeking hedonistic excess. The best psychic seers of the Eldari saw that this would lead to the downfall of their empire, because when mortal beings die, their souls go to rest within the warp. The Eldari, being psychically powerful, have very powerful souls in the warp. And the corruption of the pleasure cults was leading to many of those powerful souls ending up in the warp and beginning to coalesce into a new entity. Many of the Eldari fled their homeworlds, building enormous continent-sized ships called craft worlds to ply through the depths of space, and they created soul stones to preserve their souls upon death and keep them from falling into the warp. But the entity in the warp continued to grow, coinciding with the creation of the warp storms and psychers that caused mankind's own Age of Strife. At the dawn of the 31st millennium, however, the warp storms cleared as the fourth Chaos god Slaanesh was born, created by the Eldari and consuming their homeworlds in a rift between the immaterium and real space, a wound in physical reality that would become known as the Eye of Terror. Billions of Eldari had their souls psychically ripped away and consumed by the nascent god, and those that survived fled into the webway, their souls wounded, to found the dark city of Comorra deep in its tunnels, becoming known as the Drukhari, dark pirates who use slavery and torture to satiate the thirsting god and save their own souls. The fall of the Eldari led to the clearing of the warp storms that clouded the former interstellar empires of man, and this was when the Emperor, a powerful psyker who had dominated Terra during the Old Night, launched his Great Crusade, leading his armies into space to reconquer the galaxy as an imperium of mankind under his control. The Emperor was aware of Chaos Gods and the Warp and the danger that was posed by the demons, and how superstition and thought becomes real in the Immaterium. As a result, the Emperor sought to promote the imperial truth and stamp out religion and cults across the galaxy, something that had become common on the scattered worlds of humanity. And while doing this, his armies eliminated thousands of races in xenocidal campaigns, taking the stars for themselves. The Chaos Gods, however, worked against the Emperor and began to seduce mortals to do their bidding. Most notably, the Space Marine Primarch Horus, War Master of the Emperor's armies, and the closest thing that the Emperor had to a favoured son. In the early 32nd millennium, Horus led half of the Imperium's armies in open revolt against the Emperor. In the Horus Heresy, which would become the most damaging war to the Imperium, to humanity, since the Cybernetic Revolt. Many remaining and rare pieces of Dark Age technology were lost forever, either corrupted by chaos or completely destroyed, never to be recovered. Worlds were ruined by powerful and destructive weapons that caused extinction-level events. Billions were slaughtered as demons rampaged through real space, even running roughshod over Terra as the Imperial Palace was laid siege by the Chaos Legions. At the climax of the heresy, the Emperor himself was laid low, mortally wounded while defeating the arch-traitor Horus, with only the mysterious golden throne that he was interred upon able to preserve the Emperor's life. In the aftermath of the heresy, the imperial truth was forgotten, and the imperial faith arose in its place, worshipping the God Emperor as the last beacon of mankind's light in a dark and unforgiving universe. An Inquisition was formed, its mission to root out traitors and heretics throughout the Imperium and neutralize them, creating an atmosphere of suspicion and paranoia. The remaining traitors, meanwhile, fled into the Eye of Terror, led by Abaddon the Despoiler, where they would continue to plague the Imperium for the next 10,000 years as it continued its gradual decline. This is where the modern setting of 40k found itself for the longest time, on the verge of the 13th Black Crusade of the Chaos Forces from the Eye of Terror to assault the fortress world of Cadia, the last bulwark against the horrors of chaos. And this in itself was merely the latest step in a series of severe problems that the Imperium has faced, including the invasions of the extragalactic Tyranid hive fleets, the awakening of the ancient Necron race, a loss of communications with the most distant worlds of the Imperium, and the failing of several systems on the Golden Throne that cannot be repaired. Now, as I said, Warhammer is the setting for a tabletop game where hobbyists take armies of models that they have built and painted and use dice and tape measures to wage war with opponents. And because of this, having a static setting for decades makes perfect sense. And even the Black Library novels or tie-in video games set within the 40k universe can take place anywhere in the 41st millennium. And obviously 1,000 years of time across a galaxy of planets means that plenty of stories can be told without overlapping or treading all over each other. And that is how I was introduced to Warhammer. The town I grew up in had a Games Workshop store for as long as I can remember, and I'm sure I had glanced through the window looking at the nicely painted models on the display boards. I also remember seeing the White Dwarf magazine that the company published, full of photography and articles showing off all their models and games in local newsagents. I think my own introduction came when I purchased an issue of White Dwarf that tied into the release of what was then the new skirmish game, Mordheim, a game set in a ruined city in the Warhammer world where gangs battle and search for treasure. But the reason I purchased it was the free model it came with, an elf bounty hunter that made me think of Link from The Legend of Zelda. However, this was also a year after the release of 40k's 3rd edition, so the promotion and hype for that caught my attention when I tried to learn more. I was already familiar with model kits, having built and painted some models of various Star Trek ships over the previous years, and so learning more about the models available, several of which were getting new versions as part of the new edition's release cycle, really caught my attention. One friend at school, after seeing me reading White Dwarf and expressing interest in Warhammer, even gave me some of his old models and some issues of the magazine, and as a result I started to paint some Space Marines. And read battle reports and slowly learned the lore of the game. This led to me asking for the 3rd edition starter set for my birthday and getting quite invested in the Space Marines, who I really enjoyed the models for. Space Marines are in many ways the poster faction for Warhammer 40,000. They are genetically engineered superhumans in brightly coloured power armour. In a lot of ways they're similar to a brotherhood of monastic warrior knights equipped with the Imperium's best weapons, including the iconic chainsword and the revered bolt gun, an automatic weapon that fires large caliber rounds that explode after they hit a target. Obviously there's more to it than that, and in line with the more satirical extremes of the setting, they're in actuality quite violent and maladjusted child soldiers, essentially, who have artificially been turned into living weapons, rather than the noble paladin archetype that most of the lore and fiction sort of attempts to portray them as. But as most of the stories that exist in Warhammer are written almost from an in-universe perspective, usually by Imperial narrators, it's essentially a form of propaganda, almost to glorify the Space Marines as the God Emperor's angels of death. For me, though, I just saw visually interesting, easy to paint, multi-part kits that allowed for a lot of customization, with plenty of supplement books for different chapters of Space Marines, each of which is essentially a different army within the larger faction, with its own backstory, traditions and paint schemes. In fact, shortly after I was drawn into Warhammer, Games Workshop launched a global campaign called the Third War for Armageddon, and between a codex supplement I could easily afford at £5, packed with lore detailing the invasions of the hive world of Armageddon at the hands of the orcs, and the opening stages of the Third War for the system as the orc war boss Ghazghul Mag Uruk Thraka, a name that was inspired by the Iron Lady Margaret Thatcher herself, launched the largest orc war ever seen for millennia to completely overwhelm the Imperial defenders. And 2 issues of White Dwarf followed, containing an almighty battle report spread across 4 boards with over 12 players as Imperial forces began their counterattack. as well as all the usual rules, painting, discussions, and modelling articles. And I was pretty much instantly hooked. This was the first of several worldwide campaigns that I followed, both for 40k and fantasy, but this was the only one I actively played for. The next 40k related one actually focused on the 13th Black Crusade, with Chaos forces invading the Imperial world of Cadia to gain a foothold out of the Eye of Terror. It ended in a stalemate due to the worldwide results and how the results were reported, so the setting remained as it had, but it was a nice attempt at trying to advance the storyline in a small way. Over the following decade or so, I continued to gather Space Marine models and White Dwarf issues, following the game across its next few iterations as I grew into adulthood, even laying down funds to buy not just several starter sets to add to my force, as Space Marines were always an included faction in these sets, but also the impressive and limited edition Space Hulk boxed game, which contained some of the most impressive Space Marine models I have still seen to this day, as well as beautifully detailed board tiles to represent the ship that the game took place on. I also played several games in this time frame, but I never found the gameplay of Warhammer as rewarding as the hobby side of the fandom, the painting and the modelling. I read a few of the books, following along with the opening novels of the Horus Heresy novel series via my local library. I even managed to get several video games, taking my first foray into strategy games with the Dawn of War series, before playing the incredible console release of Space Marine, which featured Ultramarine Captain Titus fighting orcs and Chaos Marines on the Forge world of Graia. Space Marine remains one of my favourite video games and one of the best experiences I have had in the Warhammer setting. And the sequel, time of writing the blog was due out later this year. It's now out. I haven't played it yet, but I already know that it's going to be my personal game of the year. However, while many of my models were built, I struggled to find the time and motivation to paint them. Part of this was an indecision on how to paint my Marines. Did I want to paint them as the noble salamanders, one of the chapters that defended Armageddon, as the regimented Ultramarines, the default colour scheme used in all the promotional material, the haunted Blood Angels, warriors consumed by a dark and hidden curse that they must fight against, the mysterious Blood Ravens, protagonists of the Dawn of War series, or the savage Space Wolves, Viking-style warriors with animalistic tendencies. There was just so much choice, and I enjoyed all of them, and far more besides. However, it wasn't possible in the rules of the game to have a mixed force of different armies. It's not even really that much of a thing in the lore, not in the scale of army that I had. There was also the very daunting prospect of painting an entire army of models, many of which were foot soldiers, because that was what was affordable, with the same repetitive colour scheme. As a result of the hobby guilt I was getting from the lack of time playing, as well as my mounting pile of shame, as a collection of unbuilt and unpainted models is known in the community, but which in my case also included White Dwarf magazines that I had barely done anything more than skim through, I eventually stepped away from actively engaging with Warhammer. I may still have followed what was occurring online, but I eventually sold all of my miniatures except for a few pieces where I was proud of their finished paint job, one of which I even entered into their national Golden Demon painting competition. I actually have a badge for that, which is, I have a lot of badges and buttons on my bag. That's a pride of place one. And yeah, I left Warhammer behind me. However, walking away from Warhammer didn't mean that I stopped being aware of it. I still enjoyed looking at the pictures of all the new models online and learning about the new books that were coming for the then 7th edition of the game, which was in many, many ways a game changer for the setting. The biggest reason was that after having a static timeline for years, 7th edition, coming out at around the same time as the End Times, began to adopt a similar approach to that and actively moved the timeline forward. Obviously, the End Times had gotten my attention as the steps that it took had people talking about Warhammer Fantasy in a way that I had never seen, with its initial stages acting almost as a do-over of a previous worldwide campaign that had followed the Third War of Armageddon. In this case, the Storm of Chaos campaign for Fantasy that was supposed to show Chaos making a huge push, led by Archaon the Ever-Chosen as their champion, and Volten as a hero of the Empire fighting against them. The original campaign had ended in a stalemate when the worldwide results had not shown a Chaos win, however, as it had seemed obvious that Games Workshop had been trying to give Chaos a bit of a boost in order to compete with the myriad of other popular factions, to sort of almost make them the big bad of the setting. There were about the same amount of factions in both Fantasy and 40k, however, while half of the factions of 40k are unified by all being elements of the Imperium, fantasies are far more disparate. And so while there were several factions unified under the banner of Chaos, there were other threats such as the Dark Elves, the Orcs and Goblins, the Vampire Counts, Skaven and Tomb Kings, who could all threaten the forces of order. However, with how popular Chaos was in 40k as the main Nemesis faction, it made sense to try and position them into a similar way in Fantasy. Now, obviously the Storm of Chaos wasn't a success, but was very heavily focused on Chaos. While the End Times ran over 5 large campaign and lore books released over the course of more than a year, each focusing on a new front of this ongoing war, focused around a returning or a new villain for the setting and introducing dramatic changes. The End Times and the resulting reboot to Age of Sigmar would go on to be notorious among the fandom, with many seeing it as an insult to their loyalty and support for Warhammer Fantasy. But it started to rave reviews as the first book focused on the return of Nagash, who had ascended to godhood, gotten this glorious new centerpiece model, and gave any army in the setting the ability to raise the dead. So it was obviously a huge success, and so naturally it was only really a matter of time until 40k followed a similar path. It started with campaign books released throughout the editions. Unlike the previous worldwide campaigns, though, these were instead themed collections of rules, allowing you to fight themed and narrative battles around key battlegrounds in the setting. The first major one I remember was the 2-part campaign book Warzone Fenris, where the Chaos Legion, the Thousand Suns, assaulted the Space Wolves' homeworld. The most notable thing about this, however, was that it saw the release of the first Primarch model for Warhammer 40,000. The Primarchs are the beings from whom the Space Marines get their advanced genetics. They are all essentially the children of the Emperor, and thus are basically all demigods. Most of them were absent in some way from the modern setting of 40k. The Primarchs that had turned traitor during the Horus Heresy had mostly ascended to demonhood and had withdrawn into the Eye of Terror, where Abaddon had taken over their forces, and so they were not believed to be a major concern. The Loyalist Primarchs, however, had all been removed in the history of the setting, being all disappeared, lost, or killed over the millennia since the heresy. I should add that the Horus Heresy is also a game setting available from Games Workshop. Initially started for more advanced players and modelers using predominantly high quality resin models, and the Primarchs had appeared in that. But the game size of Heresy was noticeably bigger than the game size of 40k. In the gameplay itself, armies are given points values based on the units within them, and Heresy games averaged at around 1,000 points more than 40k at tournaments and events. So as a result, it was generally thought that the Primarchs would be too unbalanced for 40k, being too expensive in terms of points. Yet now here was the Demon Primarch Magnus the Red in all of his glory, as an incredible and fully plastic centerpiece model. It was literally a game changer, and it had the fandom shook because they were wondering, well, what else could change? And we soon learned as the Gathering Storm series of campaign books was announced. In a similar way to the End Times, this was a remaster of a key classic event, in this case the 13th Black Crusade, and the first book in this series suggested that huge changes were afoot, as the first book in the series was called The Fall of Cadia. Now, as I suggested earlier, the End Times, while it got people talking and gaming, had a very negative backlash during its later releases, and throughout the launch of Age of Sigmar it was hated by a lot of long-term fans, despite it bringing in a very large new audience. The reason for this was due in large part to what happened to the game. The final book of the End Times, Archaon, saw the Chaos Forces literally destroy the Warhammer world, despite the fact that several of the mortal heroes had quite literally become gods, including the returned Sigmar, Nagash, and several elven heroes, including Tyrion and Teclis. The heroes all ended up defeated, and the world was destroyed, and mortal souls were consumed en masse by the Chaos Gods, including the Skaven Great Horned Rat that had joined the Chaos Pantheon. Age of Sigmar revealed, however, that Sigmar and the other new gods had restored life to the mortal realms, only for Chaos to attack again, forcing Sigmar to unleash his new soldiers, the Stormcast Eternals, warriors that he could reforge upon death to continually fight against the darkness. By this point, though, as interesting as Age of Sigmar appeared to be, the damage was done for many fans. The Stormcast were derisively referred to by many as Sigmarines due to their perceived and, in quite a lot of cases, deliberate similarities to Space Marines. From a purely marketing perspective, everything that the fans derided about them made sense. They were designed to be a core faction that could be easy to paint and play, that could be included in every starter set, something that fantasy had not always had. But there were other criticisms of the transition to Age of Sigmar as a whole. Like, some fantasy armies such as Wood Elves and Bretonnia had not received updates in years, while others like the Tomb Kings had only recently been updated. But now all of them were sidelined, no longer being actively supported, while releases focused on all the new armies. This had happened previously in the 90s to the squats of 40k, leading to the term squatting for removing an army from the game. And the fans of the squatted armies were pretty understandably pissed off. As a result, there was a very real fear that this would happen to 40k. You know, there were videos online of people burning their armies in rage at what was going on. But like I said, there was a fear this could happen to 40k, that an advance of the timeline could lead to dramatic and sweeping changes that saw armies removed from the game. However, it had been a couple of years since the Age of Sigmar launch, and many others, including myself, suspected that Games Workshop had learned its lesson from the previous disaster, despite taking the risk to advance the timeline. But only time would tell how it would pay off. Personally, I generally enjoy the changes brought about by the Gathering Storm. Firstly, Abaddon's previous battles with the Imperium were recontextualised as part of a millennia-long game that culminated here with the destruction of Cadia, as he used weapons he had gained to destroy the planet. Next, the Eldari craft world of Bieltan was fractured, divided as part of an Eldari gambit to save their race from chaos, and leading to a new Eldari faction called the Ynnari. And finally, the return of the Primarch Rabute Guilliman of the Ultramarines, trapped forever in armour designed to save his life, to take command of the Imperium as the Emperor's regent. This then led to the 8th edition of 40k, where the Eye of Terror had now spilled out and split the galaxy in half, creating the Circatrix Maledictum, or Great Rift, a large warp storm that had caused irreparable damage to the Imperium and affected every single faction in the setting. Now, for the most part, most of this was pretty well received, by many, in fact. However, there was another change that did annoy people, which was the debut of the Primaris Space Marines. These suddenly appeared in the lore due to actions taken by the Martian tech priest Belisarius Cawl. Cawl was a new character introduced who had been given orders after the heresy by Guilliman to create new Marines, and who had also created Guilliman's armour, the life-saving armour of fate that he was wearing. Now, this was a lore change. The original Space Marines were created directly by the Emperor, and technology in 40k is not developed or innovated upon by the Cult Mechanicus of Mars. It's simply supposed to be maintained and treated with reverence and suspicion in equal measure. So Cawl's actions were pretty much unheard of and almost heretical. Many long-lasting fans and hobbyists reacted very negatively to this change and the introduction of the Primaris. In fact, videos if you search online for Primaris Space Marines, besides the shopping results, one of the main things you'll find is high-ranking videos detracting the change. Now, as I said, Space Marines were the flagship faction for 40k, and they're definitely the faction that gets favourable treatment from Games Workshop. The most releases, they get a codex rulebook for every edition, several sub-factions with their own models and rules being in every starter set, having the most novels, and so on. And that's before we even get into things like video games. However, the model line has some issues that I think that the Primaris were an attempt to correct. The first was a desire to simplify the range. The standard Space Marine unit at the time was a tactical squad, a 10-man squad featuring a sergeant with a combat weapon and a pistol, a special weapon, a heavy weapon, and 7 men with bolt guns. The standard Primaris unit is an intercessor squad, a unit of 5 or 10 men, all equipped with bolt rifles. There are still options for the sergeant, should you wish to use them. However, the main loadout is simplified and therefore a lot easier for new players. There is less of a mental load with many of the new Primaris units, in fact, with each of them seeming to be locked to a single weapon loadout with the exception of a single model. Usually the sergeant, while variable loadouts are far more common on older Space Marine squads. Secondly, there's an issue of scale. The Space Marine models have all been kept at a very consistent scale since the plastic and metal models that came out with a range redesign in 2nd edition in the early 90s. A lot of that was because a lot of those classic models were still being sold for a long time because Space Marines sell well. However, in the lore of the setting, an armoured Space Marine is supposed to tower over a baseline human, yet Imperial Guard and Eldari models were the same size as Space Marines on the tabletop. As a result, there has been a growing movement to adapt the models to true scale undertaken by hobbyists online, usually done through pretty extensive conversion of the miniature, so only really done by quite high level hobbyists. However, now that 3D printing was starting to become more accessible and more affordable, this was becoming a lot more common, and I believe that the larger Primaris kits were an attempt to rescale the range in order to have the tabletop models resemble the lore more closely, preventing players turning to these new technologies. Finally, I believe that one issue is one of intellectual property rights. During the transition from Fantasy to Age of Sigmar, several races and other words had been renamed, and this seems to have been done to replace some of the more generic fantasy names with more unique names that can be trademarked. Orcs had become Oryx, elves had become Aelves, dwarves had become Duardin, ogres had become Ogres, trolls had Troggoths, dragons Draconith, giants to Gargants, lizardmen to Seraphon, etc. Games Workshop had made previous attempts to trademark the term Space Marine, in part to prevent the sale of third-party resin cast or 3D printed bits for conversions, yet they had been unsuccessful due to the commonality of the term in sci-fi media. As a result, it was believed that the new Primaris name was designed to be one that could be trademarked, preventing third-party use in the future, something which does seem to be the case. You can find a lot of third-party Space Marines, but you don't tend to find third-party Primaris. They might be called third-party Prime Space Marines, for example. However, as time went on, it soon became apparent that this was the way forward that Games Workshop would be taking. New models were released, new game editions were successful, some old factions even returned, even the Squats, who now returned as the Leagues of Votan. Many older Marine kits got replaced by Primaris analogues or just retired from the range altogether, and the following editions continue to add more Primarchs and even upgrade previous Marine characters to the Primaris scale, while also continuing to progress the storylines at play across the setting. And we soon got novels exploring the new status quo or launching new storylines after the opening of the Great Rift. In fact, Games Workshop even launched its own subscription service called Warhammer Plus, with original animated content, all of which took place after the opening of the Great Rift, with one of the best entries, a series called Pariah Nexus, focusing on a plot of the ancient Necron race in an important area of space, and actually following on directly from the 9th edition CGI launch trailer. In fact, the Pariah Nexus would go on to be a flashpoint for campaign updates across both the 9th and 10th editions of 40k. Now, I'm a huge fan of the current direction of Warhammer, mostly. I love the Primaris model line as much as I love the classic Space Marine line, and in more recent times the 2nd edition of the Horus Heresy game led to another new scale for classic Marines, now known on the lore as Firstborn, which again meant many more great models. As a result, I decided to get back into the hobby with the 9th edition launch box, having gotten back into painting due to a Power Rangers board game I had bought the previous year. During the COVID lockdowns here in the UK, I was able to paint myself a fairly sizable force of Marines, a combination of the contents of the 9th edition's Indomitus launch box, as well as other Marines that I had bought by selling the Necron half of the launch box. Knowing that this would be an army that I would be gathering mainly to paint rather than to play the game, I decided to settle quite early on a painting scheme and created my own chapter of Space Marines. Knowing that I could easily be bored when repeating the same colour scheme dozens of times across the army, I decided to create an army that wore different colours of armour to symbolise their role on the battlefield. Something supported by the lore, technically, but not something I had ever seen done before. I christened them the Knights Chromatica, and I came up with some basic lore for them based on the models I had, and even designed a chapter symbol for them. Gradually, I was inspired more by one of the very first chapters of Space Marines described in Rogue Trader, the chapter The Rainbow Warriors, which had been named for a Greenpeace ship that had been sunk a few years prior to the release as part of the satirical nature of the early lore, and a chapter with very few mentions since. And so I wove their history in with what I had already created, making my own Knights Chromatica a successor of sorts to the Rainbow Warriors. I have since added several more models to the pile, mainly through a Partworks magazine from Hachette here in the UK, as well as buying some kits on eBay that have been retired by Games Workshop and are no longer widely available, allowing me to amass quite a collection. I'm currently in the process of revising my lore and colour scheme so that I can catch up on the models I haven't painted yet, as well as to use the painting to help improve my own mental health, something that worked wonders for during the COVID lockdowns. Getting back into Warhammer also meant I got to engage more with the community. I wasn't the only one who got back into Warhammer during COVID, and Games Workshop saw a surge in popularity that led to record profits and drew them a large amount of mainstream attention, helped by vocal fans such as former Superman actor Henry Cavill, who has been very outspoken about his love of the franchise and is currently trying to work with Games Workshop and Amazon to get a streaming franchise up and running. There were also many new YouTubers who I became aware of around this time, such as Arbiter Ian, Midwinter Minis, and former Games Workshop design team member Rogue Hobbies, as well as many others that had been running for years that I renewed my fandom for, such as Snipe and Wib, Chapter Master Valrak, and Lutin09. Some did videos looking at the lore, some did painting tutorials and discussions, some looked at old models and rulebooks, some looked at upcoming releases and rumours, but each of them offers their own distinct view on Warhammer and the hobby, and it made for a very interesting mix of content. There were also 2 web series that I got very into, as did many other fans on Reddit and elsewhere. The first was the phenomenal fan-made CGI creation Astartes, made by Syama Pedersen, which featured a small squad of Space Marines brutally assaulting a cultist ship and exterminating the human soldiers they found there before finding a larger threat. It's a dialogue-free series, it's fascinating to watch, and is a very competent piece of work to only be made by a single person. In fact, Games Workshop even made an offer to employ Pedersen to create content for their Warhammer Plus streaming service, and Astartes itself is now hosted on their community page rather than on YouTube. However, this second web series that I became a fan of was more negatively impacted by the changes Games Workshop made leading up to the launch of the Warhammer Plus service. This was a much more irreverent series called If the Emperor Had a Text-to-Speech Device, and that title is very self-descriptive. It was made by Brother Alpha Busa and his collaborators, and seems to have started as somewhat of a joke, as the God Emperor is given a text-to-speech device, allowing him to interact with his loyal custodian guard Kitten, who filled him in on the past 10 millennia of developments in the setting, causing much ire in the cranky emperor at the current state of things, leading to some radical changes. As TTS, as it became known, continued, it began to advance the storyline of 40k in its own way, beginning as it did in the more static setting of 6th edition. Many of the changes were similar in some ways to the ones actually made by Games Workshop later on, in fact, seeing the return of Primarchs, a change in the organisation of the Imperium, building up for a big final battle with Chaos. However, it was all done in a way that played a lot more of some of the memes and in-jokes of the franchise, as well as the wider internet, and it ran for several years, getting much bigger in scope. However, the launch of Warhammer Plus also saw Games Workshop release some new IP restrictions for fan-made content that were much more restrictive than what had been previously allowed. And so Brother Alphabusa made the decision to end TTS, meaning it actually ended with a cliffhanger ending, as the final 3-part episode of the series was left with its final part unfinished. This was disheartening for many, but the team behind TTS stuck together for a new series with very similar main characters set in the World of Darkness RPG setting. For many, however, the new IP restrictions and the effect that they had on many fan production was a source of much ire towards Games Workshop, especially when seen in concert with some of the business practices that were becoming much more prevalent. I've alluded to some of these changes in previous paragraphs, so let me elaborate on them here. Firstly, there were the limited edition launch boxes. See, the Indomitus box that launched the 9th edition of 40k, unlike previous starter boxes for the previous editions and the other games, was a limited run thing with exclusive models that would not be in the later release starter sets. Indomitus obviously sold out, with many of the limited boxes being very quickly bought by scalpers, who then tried to sell them on at a hugely inflated price. GW responded by making the box made to order for a limited time, allowing everyone who wanted it to get it. However, this would not be their only such box. As 9th edition went on, launch boxes containing special rulebooks and new models for armies weeks or even months ahead of their main release became increasingly common, but none of the others would ever go made to order again, and this practice spread into the other games produced by Games Workshop, such as Age of Sigmar, Horus Heresy, Necromunda, Warcry and Kill Team. It even extended to limited special editions of novels such as the Siege of Terror series that was concluding the Horus Heresy line. All that happened, though, was that all these special releases got largely claimed by scalpers, despite any attempt by GW to incorporate online queuing systems to prevent bots. Not just that, but the use of quite predatory fear of missing out tactics were used by the Warhammer community page to hype these releases. As a quick tangent, Warhammer community is a bit of a misnomer for the company's own website. The community around the Warhammer hobby has its downsides, some I will elaborate more on later, but generally is one of my favourites online. There is a lot of passion for all aspects of the hobby from most people in it. And it's often very encouraging of new people. However, the Warhammer community page has no way for the community itself to engage or discuss anything posted there. You can't comment or react, and the articles posted on that site are just hype pieces and discussions for new and upcoming releases. And it then means that pages like their Twitter and Facebook are essentially just sharing community articles. Even the Warhammer YouTube channel doesn't allow comments underneath any videos posted there, and part of this may be due to some of their other more controversial choices, some of which inspired my previous podcast on Warhammer. Firstly, there has been a disappointing trend by Games Workshop recently to not credit the people developing the game. In the past, we would be told who had sculpted the new models when they were announced. We could find out what painters worked on the in-house heavy metal painting team. Codexes and rulebooks had credits for playtesters, artists, and writers. Even the painting classes on the YouTube channel had known presenters who were able to gain followings and became known for their work. All of this led to people like John Blanche, Jez Goodwin, Brian Nelson, Ali Morrison, Mike McVeigh, Gav Thorne, Darren Latham, Duncan Rhodes, Louise Sugden, who was the aforementioned Rogue Hobbies, and many others to become notable among the community. However, recently many things are simply credited to the, quote, Games Workshop team. Now, obviously, many of the people involved here have their own social media where they can post their own work once it's officially revealed to say, I did this. But I still think it's pretty terrible. Like, in fact, even when designers and painters are interviewed on the community page, we rarely get more than a first name. Now, there may indeed be some good reasons for this. I know after several Codex rulebooks he wrote were poorly received by the player base, Matt Ward received a lot of ire from the fandom for years during 5th edition. And as the internet has made some of the worst aspects of any fandom far worse by emboldening the worst type of people to say truly reprehensible things because of anonymity and no fear of repercussion, I can imagine not having the full credit of the team members responsible would be a pretty good safeguarding tactic. This is especially the case as there have been many poorly received rules updates, as Games Workshop, in an effort to keep its games balanced, frantically scrambles whenever something breaks the game by not acting as intended. Part of this may be due to the lead time for new rules to be written, meaning that in the time between a set of rules being playtested and then being published, the main meta of the game kind of shifted quite drastically. This was most recently seen with the launch release of the Leagues of Votan, the Returned Squats for 9th edition. Their codex on launch was easily the most powerful rule set in the game, with their units having high damage output and survivability and a relatively low points cost, so they very quickly dominated the meta. And this was partially because during the playtesting phase, it had been tested against the then recent Tau Empire and Eldari codexes, both of which were also very powerful upon launch, but had received significant nerfs in updates since. As a result, Games Workshop had to scramble to acknowledge this imbalance in the game very quickly, with the updates announced between the release of the Votan launch box and their official release, something that remains an unequaled feat and led to a rather funny comment from the company's quote mascot, James Workshop, who usually only appears in videos to announce the final order dates for Christmas in each territory, who appeared in the video and mournfully said, "I'm only supposed to exist at Christmas." In fact, many of the rules updates over the past few years seem to be attempts to lower the win rates of overpowered armies based on results from tournaments held globally. The issue is that chasing the meta and tournament play is not something that the majority of the players engage in, and these sometimes quite rapid rules changes can be confusing for many much more casual players. As a result of this, I myself have been daunted by the idea of gaming again, and I haven't played a game in 5 editions now. There have also been many changes with the model line that have not been the most welcome, besides the constant price rises which have always been contentious despite not really being much higher than inflation, although Warhammer is already far more expensive than most of its competition in the wargaming hobby, both in terms of its rules and its models, and the cost of Warhammer Plus is far too high for the amount of content available there. Many people have expressed issues with many of the new model releases, as several kits have been released with admittedly an incredible level of detail, however limited to only a few poses, with less options for war gear. The update to the Orc Boys kit and the Chaos Cultists were a good example of this, as they are units from Horde armies, and so how many collectors may wish to have an army of troops made from essentially the same 10 models over and over again? In fact, the Orc one was even more disappointing, as the new unit featured a mixed weapon loadout, something that the rules didn't especially favour for the Orcs, and it also only came in 10 models, despite being able to feature boys in squads of up to 30. Fortunately, the old Orc Boys kit is also still available to allow for some variety, but it's still a pretty disheartening change. And it feels like the older kit will eventually be retired, as many other models have been. Myself, as a Space Marine collector, I've been hit with seeing several of my army's mainstay units getting retired. Many older characters are no longer available to buy, even if they do still receive rule support. And in many cases, there were older, once metal but now resin models. Several other units were also retired though, plastic kits for specific niche units such as a siege dreadnought and an anti-aircraft tank. Firstborn Marines have also had a long-standing bedrock of 3 units that the army has always been built upon. The Tactical Squad, which is a flexible unit of battle line soldiers, the Assault Squad, a unit of fast-moving close combat specialists, and the Devastator Squad, a unit of heavy weapons troopers. Even in the lore, the Space Marines have always been organised along the lines of tactical, assault and devastator squads, making up the majority of their forces. However, the Assault Squad kit was retired as soon as its closest analogue for the Primaris was released, and is now unavailable, new, except for on the second-hand market. Now, this was a hugely shocking change for me and many others, and was recently superseded when, in the lead up to the release of Age of Sigmar's 4th edition, Games Workshop announced on a now rather notorious community article that they were retiring several models, including a small Orruk faction left over from the fantasy range, a load of Skaven models that were due to be replaced in the future, the entire Beastmen range, which is now being moved to the Old World, and most surprisingly, a large amount of the Stormcast Eternals models, the oldest of which came out with the 1st edition of Age of Sigmar, and so are less than a decade old. Considering that some armies still have model kits that haven't been replaced in 20 plus years, and the success of Warhammer the Old World, which focuses almost entirely on returning a large majority of much older kits to active production, retiring a range that is that young seems like a baffling choice, and one that has many fans questioning what it could mean for their armies in the future, especially as units and armies removed from the game no longer get active rules support, being moved to Warhammer Legends and removed from tournament matched play events, as well as any current balance changes. However, there are several things that Games Workshop are doing that I do find encouraging. As I said, they had a business boom during the COVID lockdowns as people were at home, and the hobby works really well for people needing something to do in that instance. However, what this business boom did lead to was a large profit, and while Games Workshop is still susceptible to all of the tendencies that I hate about late stage capitalism, such as raising prices while boasting about record profits and seeking ever greater growth, they have in fact put their large profits to some good use. Firstly, they have engaged in a significant profit share with every member of their staff over the recent years, from designers to store staff to factory workers. They also returned the money supplied by the British government for the furlough scheme, because they didn't need it due to their increased profits. And considering many companies kept this money when they didn't even need it in the first place, I found this is something to be admired. They have also continued to expand their development headquarters in Nottingham, building a third factory and currently planning a fourth, which is creating hundreds of new jobs. So, as I said, there are good and bad things about the current direction of Warhammer, but overall, I am glad I am back engaging with the community and the hobby. Except there is one much more glaring issue that has been growing within the Warhammer fandom for a long time, and one that I can feel as the biggest issue against my current enjoyment of the hobby, and that is the right-wing element of the fandom that have been emboldened by the anonymity of online spaces to spread vile rhetoric antithetical to what I feel this community represents. Warhammer 40,000 is first and foremost a satire. Now, people think of satire as needing to be funny, as humorous satire is by far the most common. However, what Warhammer instead does is exaggeration. By its own description, as shown in the statement beginning every novel and rulebook, to live in such times is to live in the cruelest and most bloody regime imaginable. The Imperium of Man, while the central faction and the main quote-unquote heroic human faction, is a hyper-fascist autocracy that actively engages in xenophobia and dogmatic state religious fervour to keep the teeming masses of humanity subservient and unquestioning. A person's only value in the Imperium is what they can contribute to the Imperium as a whole, whether they serve in a factory building armaments or creating corpse starch to feed to the populace, whether they spend their time in back-breaking physical labour to meet the Imperial quotas and tithes, whether they are conscripted into the Imperial Guard and sent across the galaxy to fight and die in barbaric meat-grinder warfare that makes all existing human warfare in history look tame by comparison. All that matters is that you live and die in service to the golden throne of the God Emperor. Warhammer is the setting that coined the term grimdark, and it is designed to be the grimmest and darkest example of that. A dystopia where every negative trope you can think of is cranked past 11. And yet, like a lot of satire, there are many people who idolise this and see it as a good thing. People whose personal politics and desires see the example of the Imperium of Man not as something to be terrified of, but something to idolise. Part of this may be the way that I believe Games Workshop has mishandled much of this satire in some ways. The novels and fiction, for example, overwhelmingly feature an Imperial point of view, especially in anything involving Space Marines, and writing them from a view of them as heroic protagonists undercuts a lot of their horror, such as the fact that they are immortal and indoctrinated child soldiers turned into superhuman killing machines, detached from humanity and idolized as the Emperor's angels of death by any ordinary humans that they encounter and don't immediately kill, deployed to the very worst combat zones against the fiercest enemies and expected to meet their deaths in glorious battle. Yet when written as protagonists, many novels act almost as in-universe propaganda for the Space Marines, attempting to humanise them and avoiding portraying the barbaric ways they engage war in the visceral details that would show that they are not to be idolised. However, as all of the lore and fiction of Warhammer is treated like in-universe stories, with very little over the years ever being declared as non-canon or retconned, this type of conflicting and mythologized narrative is not uncommon. Now, people looking to see something positive in the worst aspects of the Imperium is nothing new, and there have always been people painting fascist symbols on their armies, or worse. But I noticed it all picking up a lot of traction while I was still away from the hobby, and even picking up some mainstream attention. It started when I began to see art from Trump supporters putting his face on the artwork of the Emperor at the height of the Great Crusade. At one point, even making a float of this for a march through a major city that ended up on the news. This is artwork of a tyrant treated as a warrior god in golden armor, and people had edited the face of a racist, ableist, misogynistic, sex offender, and now convicted felon over it as he campaigned for the presidency. This was only the beginning. It soon came out that one of the most well-known Warhammer YouTubers, Arch, formerly Arch Warhammer, had been openly racist and mocking in his own private Discord server, and the negative attention that this generated even led to Games Workshop themselves sending him a cease and desist letter telling him to stop using the Warhammer name. And it saw them issue a statement that led with the phrase "Warhammer is for everyone" and ended with "You will not be missed." A very clear statement to the intolerant that they would not be tolerated in the hobby, as exemplified in The Paradox of Intolerance by Karl Popper. Arch was a notable name, however, and he had a very large following, and he became much more openly critical of Games Workshop and Warhammer after this, but not just in the ways that many others were, such as comparing the almost archaic codex rulebook and regular balanced data slate way that GW releases their rules to the more direct, immediate app and PDF updates favoured by other, often much smaller companies, or comparing the prices of their increasingly monopose model kits to larger modular kits produced by their competitors, or even the 3D printing STLs or third-party sellers that could provide proxy units for pretty much anything they sold at a much more competitive price point. No, instead, Arch's criticism turned to many of the more regular right-wing dog whistles, such as commenting on the inclusion of more female models and characters in the ranks of the Imperial Guard and the Inquisition, or black and other minority characters on the front covers of Black Library novels. None of this should be new or surprising, and there are a great many reasons why such advances and changes are being made, not just in Warhammer but across a lot of fiction. Most obviously money and appealing to a larger audience, but also to improve the setting and have it more accurately serve as a future version of our own world as it was originally intended. Because the thing is, while what I said above about the value the Imperium and other races put on human life is correct, this has not always been well represented in the model lines. In a world where gender and race should not matter, and the law states that women soldiers are incredibly common, there have always been comparatively low amounts of female miniatures in the games themselves. Part of this is that when Warhammer started back in the 80s, there was a plan by the company, as discussed in interviews by Alan Merritt, the former head of intellectual property at Games Workshop, to release a healthy ratio of female models. However, back then, they simply did not sell. And as a result, it was even written into the lore of several factions that they didn't have women in them for various reasons. Orcs/Oryx/Orcs with a K were all mono-gendered fungoid race. Space Marines were defined as an all-male due to a quirk of the genetic processes used to create them. Bretonnian Knights were all-male due to the oaths they swore, as well as the majority of fantasy models being painted as white men due to their factions being analogous to medieval Europe. But the Sisters of Battle were also introduced, a group of battle-armoured warrior nuns for 40k, creating an overwhelming force of a majority female army that did become very popular with a group of players, having a very dedicated following for decades, even when they weren't getting a lot of active rules support. This has begun to change in recent times, however. When Age of Sigmar was launched, the Stormcast Eternals, despite being a very close analogue to Space Marines, incorporated female models almost from the get-go, and many more models started to be painted as non-white races across the Imperial Guard and Sigmar lines. In fact, the Cadian squad, shortly before the kit was completely changed as part of a line-wide relaunch, was given an extra sprue of alternate heads featuring more female and ethnic features, and several of the new Primaris Black Templar Space Marines were painted black. This was done along with a greater focus on including more diverse characters in as many novels as possible, and even creating a series on Warhammer Plus focusing on a female Stormcast Eternal named Neve Blacktalon and her allies. Obviously, all of this positive progression in representing diversity positively rather than through tokenism generated negative attention from the worst parts of the fandom, leading to Games Workshop continuing to clarify their position through more social media and community posts, including further action after a competitor called the Austrian Painter won a tournament after his competitor in the final refused to play him based on his name. A community update titled "The Imperium is driven by hate, Warhammer is not" set out plainly that prejudice, hatred, and abuse would not be tolerated, and they do not want the money or participation of anyone who feels differently. Most recently, however, several larger lore changes have occurred that have increased the diversity available, and this has obviously been very divisive. In fact, many people have taken it upon themselves to start gatekeeping Warhammer, creating a fandom at war with itself as well as with Games Workshop. The first big notable event was the launch of Warhammer the Old World, which had Bretonnians as one of its launch factions. As I've said, for the Old World, the majority of the models released are the old fantasy range. However, there are some new models as well, and the Bretonnians gained a lot of new knight models, including women for the first time, and the lore was changed to say that women knights had always existed but were rare. Now, the idea of changes to the lore being addressed as if they were always there is not uncommon. Games Workshop considers itself first and foremost a model company, and so lore is written to include new units such as squads of soldiers, heroic characters, ravening monsters, or powerful war machines as though they have always been there. For example, the range refresh that the Cadians got as part of the 9th edition Imperial Guard / Astra Militarum launch saw the introduction of a large new battle tank called the Rogel Dawn, named after a Primarch, which, despite never having been seen before, was included in the lore as always having been a part of the setting, albeit a rare piece of technology. As I said before, this tends to explain a lot of the conflicting nature of the lore as written, as it is all written from an in-universe perspective in order to explain away such discrepancies. Why had the Rogel Dawn never been seen in novels or lore before its launch? Well, perhaps the chroniclers who had written those tales had just never seen them, or were unaware of its existence. This could also be why we had never seen female Bretonnian knights before, despite it being clearly stated now that they had always existed but were rare. However, in a similar way to the launch of the Primaris, a lore retcon this severe saw many detractors. Yet, unlike that incident, many of the complaints this time were pushed by right-wing grifters who suddenly started to develop Warhammer-focused content to rant about Warhammer going woke, and this was exacerbated with the next big lore change, revealing that members of the Imperium's Custodian Guard, who only recently had been reintroduced as a tabletop faction, included female members. The Custodies themselves are also genetically engineered superhuman warriors made by a process more advanced and secretive even than the one used to create Space Marines. They were a comparatively small force, only numbering 10,000 across the entire Imperium, and their 10th edition codex included 2 named female Custodies in fiction excerpts, with one of them, the Custodian Caladace Toravalia Kesh, having her story leaked ahead of release. To say that the addition of Kesh broke the minds of the right-wing CHUDhammer is a very delicate understatement. I should state first of all that, unlike with Space Marines, it had never been confirmed in previous lore that the Custodies were all male. In fact, in Rogue Trader, it uses they and their to describe the Custodies exclusively. However, all the Custodies characters that we had ever seen in the fiction were male. All of the existing Custodies models that we had with bare helmets had male heads. The Custodies did include female units in their army list, in a similar way to the Sisters of Battle having male support units such as priests and crusaders. In this case, though, the Custodies had a dedicated support group known as the Sisters of Silence, a special faction of psychically blank warriors able to nullify chaos powers on the battlefield. So, upon the reveal of Kesh, many argued that she could be a Sister of Silence. But she is explicitly referred to as a Custodian in the story. And this did nothing to prevent the rage from many people who, by their own admission, have never played Warhammer, purchased a model, or even read a Warhammer novel, leading many like myself to wonder just how genuine their fan concern really is. Unfortunately, this is becoming far more common in every fandom space as executives begin to realise what creatives and fans have always made clear, which is that not all geeks are straight white men, and that women, queer folks and ethnic minorities all enjoy things like Star Trek, Marvel, Star Wars, D&D, and yes, even Warhammer, and more importantly that they always have, and that they will reward companies that make an effort to include and represent them, despite how much chuds like to cite the blatantly incorrect "go woke, go broke" mantra that they cling to. It should also be stated that as yet, despite this change, there is no further representation of female Custodies than there was before. There are no models of explicitly female Custodies and no characters in any published novels that are female Custodies. The confirmation is exclusively limited to Kesh and her fellow Custodies in the Codex. That was as I originally wrote this article. This has now changed with the latest Warhammer Plus animation, the Tithes, featuring a female Custodies in its latest episode. And she's also amazing. She's incredibly badass, looks incredible. And loads of right-wingers have joined on a dogpiling effort on her, not just by her very existence, but also saying that she's not pretty enough. Now, a large part of the reason why the inclusion of women is such a particular issue for many among the Warhammer community, I say many, it's probably a very vocal minority, is because of a growing discussion in fan spaces for the desire to include female Space Marines. As I said, currently in the lore there are no female Space Marines, and technically they cannot exist. But as Alan Merritt said, they were always intended. In fact, 2 women in Space Marine power armour were released back during the Rogue Trader days and intended to be the first female Space Marine models. And there were others that were also made but never officially released. Nowadays, many third-party sites sell bits that can be used to customise Space Marine models in a variety of ways, and female Space Marines are a commonly found offering. Obviously, they can vary in design, from pin-up style models to vaguely Space Marine aesthetics to large head swaps designed to give the Marines exaggerated proportions. I even have some of the latter among my own Knights Chromatica, and I'm far from the only one. Whole sites and fan-made materials are dedicated to the lore and modelling of entire chapters of female Marines, sometimes with uniquely commissioned artwork. Now, CHUDhammer is adamant that this change should never be canonised by Games Workshop, that it is an immutable tenet of the lore that the genetic modifications required to make Space Marines from normal humans require the male Y chromosomes. Never mind the poor science used to explain this in the original lore, the origins for the change, or even the biological chromosexual reality of gender diversity and intersex individuals, especially in our own real world. Now, I can understand wanting female Marines to look a certain way, and as I said, I use the exaggerated proportions of certain female Marine heads rather than simply performing head swaps with Sisters of Battle, for example, as the Sisters are all baseline humans without genetic modifications, giving them realistic proportions and attractive features, which to me does not fit the aesthetic of Space Marines. I believe that there is already a perfect way in universe to include this change, by simply saying that Belisarius Cawl had once again improved upon the Emperor's science, just as he did with the Primaris, who have more genetic modifications than Firstborn Space Marines. In fact, this precedent already exists, not just with the introduction of the Primaris of a whole, but the transition of several Firstborn characters to the new Primaris scale being explained in lore as something thought impossible with a high casualty rate, until it was successfully performed by Cawl on wounded Ultramarine Chapter Master Marneus Calgar. And it is now referred to in universe as Firstborn crossing the Rubicon Primaris to be reborn. A similar lore reason could easily be given to include official female Space Marines, and like the Cadian upgrade sprue or the alternate heads for the Bretonnian Foot Knights, all that's needed is an alternate bare head or two per box of Space Marines, as most rank and file Marines wear their helmets into battle anyway. I think it's clear that I, like a majority of fans, am perfectly fine with the conclusion of female Marines, and that it makes perfect sense to me as an outdated piece of lore that deserves to be retconned, and could easily be explained away in universe as either a new change or an always there but rare and unexplored aspect of the Space Marines, either of which would be perfectly fine. Despite all of this, the ever-increasing toxicity of aspects of the fandom, as someone who openly struggles with my mental health, is debilitating. I engage with Warhammer because I love it. I enjoy the setting, the models, the lore, the creativity of the community, and so much more besides. Yet many of the fan spaces I enjoy are being riven by division from the gatekeepers and grifters that have glommed onto the community and are investing it with their own malignant version of Nurgle's rot. And while I have my own issues with many of Games Workshop's business practices, such as the rules having a barrier to entry due to cost and balance updates, models being retired or limited release, artists not being credited, and so on, and while there are so many changes I wish they would make to benefit consumers like myself, what they do clearly works for them, as shown by their profits. And some steps like their IP restrictions are clearly necessary now that they are seeking expansion with entities like Amazon. Yet even with all of that taken into account, I still check the community page daily, looking forward to new releases across all of their settings, not even just Warhammer 40k. I like looking at the new releases for the Old World, for Blood Bowl, for Warhammer Fantasy, for Age of Sigmar. And I still love Warhammer World, their central headquarters in Nottingham that includes a 5-room exhibition centre, including dramatic battle dioramas that contain tens of thousands of posed and painted miniatures. And it's a location I like to visit at least once a year to see the incredible models on display. So in conclusion, while I'm unsure where I stand with the community, I know that I am in no great desire to leave this hobby again. While I may not be playing Warhammer actively, I intend to paint my army, to complete their lore, to take photographs of them, and to continue watching the YouTubers I do and read more novels set in this universe. I intend to continue collecting and painting Warhammer, finding old marine novels on eBay to build and paint, and most importantly, I intend to continue to share my love and passion for this universe, to encourage others to dive into what I think is an incredibly fun setting, because I truly do believe that Warhammer, because of its vast and diverse nature, really does offer something for everyone. Warhammer is for everyone. So thanks for listening to that. The reason I wanted to record this one and share it as a podcast as well as just a blog was because I was very proud of this. This was something that had been on my mind for a while as wanting to discuss, and when I wrote it as a blog I didn't really feel up to recording at the time. Obviously that's starting to change, so I'm very hopeful that more positive changes can continue soon. But also, when I started writing this, it just came out, and it's ended up being over 12,000 words long, which makes it one of the longest things I've ever written. And you know, this is something I am proud of, that I think, you know, Warhammer is important to me. The Warhammer fandom and community is important to me, and I love seeing the art that people make with Warhammer. I love seeing people's painted models. Every social media platform I am on, right, whether it's Twitter, Reddit, Facebook, Instagram, I follow painting accounts, Warhammer accounts, meme accounts, because I love Warhammer so much. And seeing those spaces, seeing any search for Warhammer getting infested recently with trolls and with, you know, I didn't coin the term CHUDhammer, but I do love it. I think it was started by Bitshammer on Twitter. And, you know, seeing people complain about models that, you know, are painted in fantastical ways. Like, there is a person on Twitter I follow called CerberusXT who paints Pride miniatures. He takes the colours of a Pride flag and incorporates it into the model to paint that model styled after a Pride flag. And he's done it with a lot of Space Marines. He's done it with some models from every faction. And if you think about it, that's actually a really good painting challenge, right? Because say you decide to paint a model based on the Trans Pride flag, for example. The Trans Pride flag has 3 colours. It's like a cyan blue, a pink, and a white. You are limiting yourself to making a colour scheme for a model using just those 3 colours. That's impressive to do that. Or some of the other flags that have got like 7 or 8 colours in, and he does it with that as well. And the models look amazing. Like, his painting is so clean. Like, I'm jealous of how well the dude paints. But every time he posts one of his new models, you just see the responses underneath of people going, oh, you've made it woke, or even just slurring, like openly slurring and being despicable about queer people, or saying that we should die or he should die, or just such vitriolic hatred underneath the models. Or my favourite one that you hear from right wingers: why did you have to make it political? Warhammer's always been political. The Orc Warlord is named after Thatcher. It's always been political. It's inspired by things that were political. Oh, they. And I love Warhammer. I really like being engaged with Warhammer. I love, like I said, I love going to Warhammer World. I've got books full of I've got so many Warhammer books, rule books and lore books mainly, rather than the novels. I don't tend to own many of the novels. I've got a few on Audible. That's not a promotion. I just like them. I'm currently reading The Devastation of Baal, which is about the Blood Angels attack. The Blood Angels defending their homeworld from a Tyranid invasion. That one's really good. There's also a Necron novel called The Infinite and the Divine, which I will recommend to anyone. I am not a fan of the Necron lore, but I love that novel. It's so fun. It's just these two immortals in a decades-long pissing contest with each other. It's hilarious. Decades long, millennia long, centuries long, game of one-upmanship with each other. It's absolutely fantastic. But yeah, Warhammer is good. There's a lot to like about Warhammer, and it's like, Space Marine 2 has just come out. I don't have it yet. I really, really want to play it, but I just cannot afford it at this time. I want to keep painting my models. I've come up with a new color scheme for my models that I'm really excited. I want to try and get some paint stripper so I can strip the paint off a lot of my older models and redo them, because I've come up with a more unified color scheme. And again, I've limited myself to color choices on that. I have limited myself to the 8 basic rainbow colors. And you might think, oh, there's only 7 colors in the rainbow. 8 because I've included like a magenta pink style color, and so I'm going to incorporate magenta, red, yellow, orange, green, blue, cyan, purple across the Marines. And the cyan, orange, purple and magenta are going to be unifying colors, and then I've got the red, yellow, green, purple and white as like highlight colors on different models, and also like gold and silver and maybe black, I'm not sure. So I want to rework things. I'm working on my lore for my Knights Chromatica, and actually I've gone on a deep dive into the lore of the Rainbow Warriors after a video by Rogue Hobbies, and looked more into them and their existing lore and tried to really, really dig into it. So I'm doing all of this, and because I love this setting and I'm looking forward to playing Space Marine. I've seen the in-game painter for your Space Marines. All of mine are going to be Knights Chromatica, all of them. So yeah, this is what I'm doing. And yeah, seeing the, like I said, it's obviously a very, I don't by any means think it's the majority of the fandom. I don't think it's even half the fandom or even a quarter of the fandom. I think it is just a very, very vocal minority of Warhammer fans with a lot of right-wing grifters glommed onto it. And it's just becoming tiresome. And it's happening everywhere. Right-wing grifters coming in and outrage merchants to gather clicks and just to be awful people. in every fandom, whether it's Warhammer, whether it's Star Wars, whether it's Marvel, and it's just becoming so tiring when it's things that you enjoy. And I love Warhammer, and seeing this happen over and over and over again makes it really hard to continue interacting with the community in these online spaces, and that's not what I want. So yeah, I'm going to carry on being part of the Warhammer fandom. I'm going to carry on existing in this fandom, being actively engaged with it in the spaces that I am. I'm going to comment on models. I'm going to repost things. I'm going to like pictures. I'm going to look at lore. I'm going to carry on looking at the Warhammer community page. I'm probably going to still carry on buying Warhammer stuff. Because I enjoy it. This fandom, this community brings me a lot of joy. These models bring me a lot of joy. This setting brings me a lot of joy, despite the grim darkness. And so I want to carry on enjoying that. And that's what I intend to do. And that means that I want to be an ambassador for the best parts of this community. And that's what I'm hoping I will do. So if anything I've said in either this or my previous Warhammer blog has inspired you to look at Warhammer, to maybe pick up a book and read it, to maybe paint or play a model, or even just going, if you go into your local Warhammer store, they will give you a free model. They will teach you how to paint it. There's 2 starter models. There's also a miniature of the month every month. And you can build it there in store. They will give you the tools. They'll give you the paints. If you wanted to paint a demo model, they will teach you how to play your first game for Warhammer, Age of Sigmar, or 40k. The staff in Warhammer stores are so friendly. And, they've usually got cabinets of things they've worked on. Like, I like visiting Warhammer stores up and down the country because the people who work there are hobbyists, and they paint their own stuff and put it in the cabinets there. And there's stuff there that's either been painted by staff members or people who go into the shop, and you can ask about it. Like, I went into a really small store in Stratford upon Avon. The woman running the store that day, I'm not sure if she's the actual manager or if she was just a staff member there, absolutely lovely. She had in her cabinet models that she'd obviously worked on, each of them exemplifying a different technique, and then she'd put little bits, or the staff there had put little bits in front of them saying, this is the technique we worked on this model. If you would like us to teach you about it, come and ask. It's such a welcoming hobby. It shouldn't be riven with hate and rot because of CHUDhammer. So, screw 'em. We're all about Warhammer positivity here. Thank you very much for listening and hearing me ramble. Obviously, this last bit was not scripted, as you can tell by how random this was compared to the rest of the episode. This is probably one of my shorter normal podcasts. I told my partners, and they said, yeah, it's going to be a normal length for an actual podcast. And I said, yeah, but it's not a normal length for one of mine. I'm going to have the original blog linked in all the descriptions if you want to go and read the original, or any of my other blogs on my blog spot. It's all in the link tree as well, along with everything else. I've been putting watch orders up there recently, which I'm going to be linking to some of the previous episodes and going back to in future episodes. So there's that as well. For now, I'm going to let you go. All I'm going to say is, as always, do your best to look after yourself, your physical and mental health as best as you can, because I know how fucking hard it can be, and I want everyone to look after themselves the best they can. If you need help, reach out. You can even reach out to me if I'm the only person that you feel comfortable reaching out to. I will try and help. Even with my own issues, I will try and help. I would rather help someone than ignore them. You all look after yourselves. I love you all. I'm so grateful for every single one of my listeners. I will be back sooner rather than later, hopefully. I know it's been a while, but bye for now. Thank you for joining us here at Garhdo Goes Geek. Your support of this podcast means the absolute world to me, and I am grateful to everyone who listens. If you wish to engage more with myself and my co-hosts, we have a few other ways to do this. Firstly, if you go to the link tree linked in the description, you'll find links not just to this podcast on every platform, but also to our Discord server, where you can interact directly with all of us, and a link to a dedicated subreddit for this podcast. There is also a link to a supporting blogspot page, where I'll be posting supporting material for this podcast, including progress updates, schedules, and watch orders for the content I cover should you wish to watch along with me. I also have a link to a Spotify playlist featuring some of the music items I've discussed in the podcast. You can also add me on Facebook if you so wish, or follow on Twitch, where I'll be hosting a weekly stream. Finally, there is also a link in there to Ko-Fi, where you have the option to leave a one-time tip if you so wish, or alternatively to commission your own podcast episode. So if there is a topic you would like me to cover that I have yet to do so, then you can request I cover it for a small sponsorship fee. However, if you do not have the means to do so, then all I ask is that if you could please like, subscribe, and share this podcast with anyone else you think may like it. I love you all. Until next time, bye for now.